In the long reign of a single queen, Britain changed the world and was itself utterly transformed. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. By the time she died in 1901, we had made the modern world.
It was a time of brilliant engineering, pioneering innovation, all of it driven by fearless men and women who dreamt big and shaped the country we live in today.
Fast and effective new transport systems shrank the world.
You travel further, faster. The railways compress space and time.
Startling innovations above and below ground saved lives.
We'd grab the saw like this.
It's more like carpentry than surgery.
Groundbreaking ideas nurtured our minds and souls.
It was feeling like you were dancing in one of the great European palaces.
And a revolution in law and order set us on course for the freedoms we take for granted today.
You're brought from the darkness of the prisons into this glory.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
It is.
This is the story of how the Victorians built Britain.
One of the building blocks was the health of the nation.
In the early 1800s, if you were sick or hurt, the very last place you'd want to be taken is a hospital. I think this is the most chilling room in London.
But the Victorians changed all that.
Casualties were reduced from about 50% to about 15%.
Brilliant minds and bold experiments saved lives.
If it was good enough for a queen, it was probably good enough for them as well.
Pioneering visionaries built great cathedrals of medicine.
The Victorian innovators would bring the nation's health into the modern age. The Victorians more or less invented modern health care, but the good that they did had its roots in the most sinister kind of evil. It was the arrest of two of Britain's most notorious serial killers that was to transform the study of medicine.
At the turn of the century, here in Edinburgh and across the country, anatomy schools had a major problem. Because dissection was considered disrespectful to the dead, the only corpses available for study were murderers who'd been executed.
So, there was a desperate need for bodies.
Desperate need. So people started robbing graves within the first few days of somebody being buried. People would come along, dig up the body, and take it to the anatomy school and sell it.
They say dead men tell no tales. So I'm relying on Janet Philp here amongst the tombs of the old Carlton burial ground.
Now, the most notorious names in this are Burke and... no relation. Burke and Hare. Who were they?
They are the most notorious known grave robbers, and yet actually they didn't rob graves at all. So Burke and Hare were two Irishmen who came over to work on the Grand Union Canal.
William Hare ran a boarding house in the West Port area of Edinburgh. His friend William Buerk lived on the same street. Around Christmas 1827, their friendship turned into something more sinister when Hare discovered one of his lodgers, an elderly soldier known as Old Donald, had died in his bed.
He died owing Hare money, allegedly £4. And so Burke and Hare thought, we can get your money back by selling the body to the anatomists.
The pair took Old Donald to Dr. Robert Knox, a distinguished professor of anatomy. Always on the lookout for fresh cadavers, he jumped at the chance to buy the body, paying Burke and Hare nearly £8, a substantial sum in those days.
So a light bulb must have gone on in Burke and Hare's minds at that stage.
Dr. Knox, he had said to them, if you ever come across any more fresh bodies, we'll be happy to take them off your hands.
But where to get the fresh ones?
They went straight to killing people. The next victim was somebody who was in that lodging house who was getting ill. So they suffocated this person with a pillow and then sold his body to the doctors.
Over the next 10 months, Burke and Hare quietly murdered 16 people, selling their bodies on to Dr. Knox.
They developed this way of killing, which we now call Burking, after Burke, where they hold the nose shut, put the fingers under the mouth so the mouth can't be opened either, and the other person lies across the body.
The result being you get a corpse with no mark on it, no wounds.
No wounds. Looks like they've suffocated. Up until recently, they were the most successful UK serial killers.
How were they rumbled in the end?
They had a Halloween party, and during this, they ended up killing this woman and hiding her under the bed. The next day, some people who'd been staying with Burke discovered the body, and they called the police.
The trial that followed gripped the Victorian public. They made up songs about the pair, like this one. Up the close and down the stair, in the house with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the man who buys the beef. Dr. Knox was never tried, but Hare turned king's evidence, testifying against Burke for the murders. He got off scot-free, while Burke was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging.
So the 28th of January 1829, between 25 to 30,000 people watched the execution.
And in a piece of macabre justice, his body was then dissected. Burke's death mask lives here at the Surgeons' Hall Museums in Edinburgh. But curator Christopher Henry tells me there's one more grisly twist to the tale.
William Burke, he was dissected, but he was also flayed, so all of his skin was taken off, and then it was tanned. And when it was tanned, it was sold as souvenirs to various people. And we've got an example here. This is Burke's skin pocketbook. It's probably one of our most famous artefacts.
So this is Burke's skin
This
that's
is
been tanned?
Yes, you can
I'm not
see.
surprised you're wearing gloves.
Yeah,
It's a gruesome.
Yeah, it is. And it says actually on the back, executed 28th of January 1829.
The actions of Burke and Hare were a wake-up call for the medical establishment. In 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed, allowing the legal donation of bodies. It was the first step towards the creation of the modern profession, and some of the great medical schools and anatomical collections of the Victorian age, like the Surgeons' Hall here in Edinburgh, giving students the chance to study the innermost workings of the human body.
And this speeding up of the study of anatomy produced one of the most famous, if not the most famous, medical textbook of all time.
Exactly, and here we have Gray's
Anatomy. Not the television programme.
Not the television programme, the original.
Gray's Anatomy is a landmark in medical history. With text by the surgeon Henry Gray, it's a lifetime study of the human body distilled into a book small enough to be carried around. Illustrated by Henry Carter's beautiful, mind-blowingly accurate drawings.
The fact that each part of the illustration is labelled, so it's quite clear when you look at the illustration, you've got the label on the actual item that you're referring to. Now, that doesn't sound like an earth-shattering thing, but it actually was, because if we talk about all of those people who are now learning medicine, they were then able to have a volume that they could carry around with them and consult with known information which was reliable. And I think that is one of the key things about Gray's Anatomy.
Gray's Anatomy was published in 1858. Students and surgeons alike flocked to buy this groundbreaking roadmap of the human body. Remarkably, Gray's Anatomy is still in print today, One small, perfectly formed textbook, one giant leap for medical knowledge. However, the outlook for anyone needing an operation was less than rosy. To survive the surgeon's knife, you had to be very lucky indeed. Across Britain, a very Victorian revolution was underway, giving us the grand hospitals and world-class medical schools that we know today. At its heart was a desire to map the workings of the human body. Despite the great strides in anatomical understanding, you were still as likely as not to die on the operating table. Those willing to take their chances under the surgeon's knife might have been brought here, to the operating theatre of Old St Thomas's Hospital in London.
Good Lord.
Built in 1822 with its tiered viewing platforms, the old operating theatre is the only surviving Victorian surgical theatre in Europe.
You can see, can't you, why it's called an operating theatre?
Yeah, it's a very good view, actually.
Now the building is a treasure trove of grisly secrets, guarded by the curator, Karen Howell.
All this is packed, is it?
All of this would be packed with medical students, 150 people, we think.
Really?
They used to pack them in like this, so they would be hanging over, herrings in a barrel.
For the eager medical students, it was a fantastic chance to watch and learn from skilled surgeons.
Gosh, they're big steps, aren't they?
But for the patients wheeled into the packed room, it was a very different story.
So this is it, the operating table.
Yes.
Wooden, bit of a backrest.
Yeah.
But what, just looking around, there's no running water.
No, there's no running water in this room at all. There's a wash bowl, and the idea of that was that you wash your hands afterwards as you leave.
The surgeon washed afterwards?
Yeah.
But not before?
Not before.
What sort of procedures did they do here?
1 in 5 operations done here are called amputations.
Amputations. And you've got some of the instruments, haven't you, that
Yes.
the surgeons use?
Yes, we've got some instruments here. This sort of knife here would be for removal of an adult-sized leg. And you can see how long and fine the knives are. These are very fast saws, and they're still used.
Give me some idea of how this worked.
Well, the patient be brought in, they're pinned down.
They're held down by blokes?
Yeah, the patient, unfortunately, is awake. There's no anaesthetic.
Yeah.
They'll give you a leather bit. So you bite on a leather bit like this, because that would stop you biting your tongue, because that's very important.
Stop you screaming too, perhaps?
Yeah, it's very primitive, but it worked. We would get this blood box.
Well, full of sawdust?
It is full of sawdust to stop any blood escaping. And we take the knife here.
Yeah.
So the leg runs through, and then we pull like this. The other side, pull.
Yeah.
And any cuts underneath like this. And the idea was that you were making an arch.
Gosh.
So then we would have a person pull those flaps back. That's the gory bit. We'd grab the saw like this. So can you imagine the bone is visible?
Yep, all too easily.
And then we would go through. And we know that it would be about 12 cuts. Bone breaks through. Then we would take the needle, often from the clothes. So you bring the flaps back over, sew and seal it off. And the idea is that now is a sealed amputation.
I mean, it's more like carpentry, isn't it, than surgery. It's incredibly unhygienic. So what skills for a surgeon were most prized?
The fact that you could do it quickly is very important. They would be trained to try for 12 minutes.
But the really good surgeons, how fast could they take a leg off?
Robert Liston's the fastest acknowledged because it was recorded at 28 seconds.
He got a leg off in 28 seconds?
Yeah.
The statistics were grim. Of those who made it through the operation, half would die of post-op infection.
I think this, in many ways, is the most chilling room in London. You just think what it would have been like to have been brought in here as the patient, laid out on this wooden table with 150 people craning forward to see you being cut up. No anaesthetics, with just something to chew on while they chopped your leg off. Makes you really glad to have been born in the 20th century and living in the 21st century, doesn't it?
But change was coming. While some of the great Victorian innovators were altering the landscape and the lives of ordinary people, in Glasgow, one pioneering surgeon was about to make a discovery that would change surgery forever. In 1865, the Scottish surgeon Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgery to the world. It was a breakthrough that would revolutionise modern medicine and save millions of lives. Lister's brilliant flash of inspiration came from the very last place you'd expect: the sewers. Deep in the bowels of the sewers in Carlisle, the authorities were trying to get rid of the unholy stink using a chemical, carbolic acid. Lister had learned that the chemical not only reduced the smell, but also reduced disease in people living nearby. He began to wonder whether carbolic acid was killing germs and whether it might be the way to stop wounds from becoming infected.
Lister's first breakthrough really was at Glasgow Royal Infirmary on a young chap called James Greenleaf, who had a compound fracture of the leg. And Lister experimented by pouring carbolic acid into the wound. And in a short space of time, they realised that there actually was no infection there. Within a few weeks, Greenleaf's leg was beginning to heal very, very successfully. Lister knew he was onto something.
Spurred on by this early success, Lister began to develop all kinds of ways to keep bacteria at bay. Things we take for granted today, like washing hands and equipment, and wearing surgical gloves. But his masterstroke was yet to come.
And then Lister developed this, which is the carbolic steam spray. And you heated up the water to allow it to gather up a head of steam, a bit like a kettle. And at the front, we've got this glass jar which contains the
carbolic acid had been there.
Yeah, it's in there. And the steam came out of a nozzle at the top here.
So this would be puffing it out like an aerosol everywhere.
Absolutely. If you can think of a kind of exotic spray can, that's pretty much what it was like. That could sit on the table next to the wound and they would be able to then work within that cloud to do the operation.
How much of a difference was this making?
I think you can roughly say that the casualties were reduced from about 50% to about 15%.
Wow.
So it was a big reduction in deaths.
How much of a turning point in the whole advance of medicine does Joseph Lister and antisepsis represent, do you think?
I think it's absolutely huge. It's one of the biggest, really. And certainly he influenced a whole generation of people. We're still really reliant on Lister's ideas that brought us to where we are now.
Lister's innovations had laid the foundations of modern medicine and saved countless lives.
The Victorians now turned their attention to the nation's hospitals and began building the very fabric of our healthcare system, brick by brick.
The immense St Thomas's Hospital on the banks of the River Thames in London.
And Great Ormond Street, the country's first ever children's hospital.
Driven by the shockingly high infant mortality rate in London, Great Ormond Street opened in 1852 and was funded, among others, by Charles Dickens. It was the first hospital to recognise that children needed tailored care, and its pioneering treatments made it famous the world over. But among all these distinguished Victorian hospitals, there was one that would leave a unique and lasting legacy. This is Leeds General Infirmary, a Victorian masterpiece of hospital design. It opened its doors in 1869 and has been treating patients for over 150 years. Professor Michael Buerk knows the extraordinary story of a hospital at the forefront of a revolution in healthcare.
The population of Leeds in 1800 was 30,000. By the time this opened, it was over 100,000. This was the state-of-the-art infirmary that an ambitious industrial town like Leeds would want to have.
This grand vision was inspired by the ideas of a true Victorian pioneer.
When war broke out with Russia, one woman's experience of the battlefield helped shape the modern hospital, transforming them into places of recovery and cure.
She was the Lady of the Lamp, Florence Nightingale. Stationed in a field hospital during the Crimean War, young Florence was horrified to discover that more men were dying from disease than in battle. She set about improving conditions for the soldiers with medical supplies and cleaner, better ventilated wards.
The hell of a battlefield dressing station wasn't far removed from the conditions in Britain's hospitals. They were dirty, dark, rat-infested, with little ventilation and no fresh water. In 1849, a single outbreak of cholera killed 200 children. Something had to change.
Florence Nightingale believed the layout of hospitals was the key. She and others championed a blueprint called the Pavilion Plan, with the aim to improve patients' chances of recovery.
To what extent did Leeds Hospital adopt the principles that Florence Nightingale had been advancing?
Her view of disease and infection was a view of where diseases emerged from bad atmospheres, pollution, and disorder. What Nightingale and the Pavilion Principle was all about was what one might call the kind of halo principle. One had to have hygiene, air, light, and order.
The wards, each with a maximum of 30 beds, were built alongside courtyards. And with their high ceilings and large windows, the new wards were designed to let in light and fresh air, minimizing the chance of patients catching disease from one another.
The thinking was that the hospital should do the patient no harm. The length of the wards meant that the nurse could sit at one end and see 30 patients. The order in the ward meant that the patients were rested, they were well fed, and therefore their bodies were unlikely to break down and develop disease.
Nightingale's ideas influenced hospital design for decades. The methods employed here at Leeds set a gold standard for healthcare that would be adopted by hospitals in Britain and across the world. But for all their magnificent hospitals, the Victorians still had a long way to go in tackling Britain's great taboo, the treatment of the mentally ill. The Victorians were reshaping the nation's healthcare with exciting discoveries and radical reforms. But the most ambitious of all was yet to come. This was the era of the asylum and the psychiatric hospital, when vast institutions like Broadmoor would gain public notoriety, but would also change our views on mental health forever.
In the 18th century, people with mental illness or disability were almost always kept at home and cared for secretly by their families. There were a few private institutions where the wealthy could have a family member taken away and cared for discreetly. If you didn't have family or money, then the most likely outcome was the workhouse or prison.
But the Victorians were about to turn the treatment of the mentally ill on its head. At the Science Museum in London, one person who understands the significance of this seismic change is Natasha McEnroe.
At the beginning of this period, was the main purpose in any way to treat people with mental illness?
Treatment was not part of the regime. Particularly for the first half of the 19th century, people with mental health issues were almost treated as prisoners rather than as patients.
For these unfortunate souls, the outlook was bleak.
The element of restraint is very strong, isn't it?
Yes, so these could range from shackles, being tied to posts or to the walls, in some cases for months or years, or even the ubiquitous straitjacket.
Oh, you've got some here.
Yes, we have. We have an adult straitjacket and, very sadly, one that would have been used for child patients. It's an important reminder, I think, that children were completely mixed up with adults in psychiatric care. It wasn't separate treatment at all.
These methods of restraint and isolation, which today we regard as extreme, included the infamous padded cell.
Yes, this is an original padded cell from Farnborough Hospital.
Look at the door on it. I mean, once that thud's closed and the bolts on this clunk, clunk across here, not just locked away, but you can't hear them either.
Yeah. Normally, if you're locked in, you can hammer on a door, but in here, nobody can hear you.
Horrible thought, isn't it?
But in 1838, a book was published. One man's expose of the horrific treatment he'd endured during 3 years in private asylums.
What sort of impact did the book have?
Well, it had a massive impact. Shortly after its publication, the 1845 Lunacy Act came out. This made a massive change for the way that mental health patients were cared for in Britain.
And this was the result. Every county now had a duty under law to create places that could care for people with mental health issues. Purpose-built asylums, like this one in Coney Hatch, sprang up all over the country.
Natasha, it's not my idea of a Victorian lunatic asylum. It's more like a palace. It's absolutely enormous.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is an Italianate-style palace that is disguising its real nature.
In typical Victorian style, the architecture of these new asylums was the grandest, the biggest, and the most beautiful it could possibly be. When it opened its doors in 1851, Coney Hatch had beds for 1,250 patients. The corridors stretched for 6 miles. But size wasn't everything.
What was special about it?
It's really the first Victorian mental asylum that employed what was then called the moral treatment.
The moral treatment was about as far away from chaining a patient to a wall as you can imagine. And Coney Hatch was the pioneer.
The treatment was very much focused on, I suppose, what we would now call work therapy.
These photographs, taken inside one of the many asylums that followed Coney Hatch's example, are a rare glimpse into the daily lives of patients.
There was workshops to make woodwork. Many of the women patients would work in the laundry. They grew a lot of their own food. Keeping pets, particularly birds, were very popular, caged birds. But work was something that was seen as a way of rehabilitating them.
After decades of enlightened treatment, sadly by 1890, because of overcrowding, many asylums had gone back to the old methods of straitjackets and seclusion, and were even using drugs to sedate unruly patients. Medication was to play an increasing role in the treatment of specific mental health problems in the century that followed. For the Victorians, remedies were mainly used for physical ailments. However, unless you were in a hospital, access to medication was pretty hit and miss.
Most people who could called in a private doctor or turned to the all-singing, all-dancing apothecary.
Apothecaries were qualified herbalists, the forerunner of the modern chemists, who sold their remedies direct to patients, often over the counter. Their shop fronts were designed to attract customers, with large adverts and brightly filled jars.
Some of the biggest names on the high street grew from the seeds of those early apothecaries. Vast commercial empires founded by savvy Victorian entrepreneurs.
Beecham's, whose patented pills were one of the most popular over-the-counter medicines. Andrew's liver salts, still sold today. And the granddaddy of high street pharmacies, Boots, which began as a neighbourhood chemist's in 1849, but by the end of the Victorian era had established shops on high streets up and down the country. But for the early Victorians, getting hold of medicines meant placing your trust in the hands of the herbalist. This is the Herb Garret, an original herbalist's attic in South London, where I've come to discover the dark art of the Victorian apothecary. These herbalists brewed and bottled all kinds of homemade pills, elixirs and ointments. Guiding me through this cabinet of curiosities is Karen Howell.
This one we would talk about as a proper active drug.
Yeah. How do you pronounce it?
Cinchona bark.
Cinchona bark. Oh, yeah. What does that do then?
It's an anti-malarial.
Is this something to do with quinine?
It's quinine that's the active.
So this actually does work with fever?
Yes, it does.
And actually it works with tonic water, doesn't it?
It does with gin. With gin.
Doesn't smell of anything, actually.
Yeah, you don't want to snort it too. You'll have to have a gin to go with it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Although some remedies actually worked, others had devastating side effects. Belladonna eye drops might make you go blind. Mercury for syphilis would poison you slowly.
Here, there's a lovely bottle. In the sense, it's quite a scary bottle, but it's an elixir of heroin. Yeah. And so the idea is that it would help you sleep.
But this is the extraordinary thing. It says dose here, 1 to 2 tablespoonfuls. Children, 1 to 2 teaspoonfuls. Yeah. So actually you're giving children heroin.
Yeah.
While the public were happily buying over-the-counter heroin, European chemists had made an interesting discovery.
Never ones to miss a trick. The Victorians were keeping a close eye on the continent, where a new wonder drug was emerging, cocaine. In 1879, a German doctor called Vasily von Anrep was experimenting with frogs' legs, dipping them into a solution of salt and cocaine to see what impact it had on the nervous system. It turned out it numbed the nerves rather well.
In 1884, a Viennese ophthalmologist, Karl Köhler, successfully used a mild solution of cocaine to numb his patient's eyes.
News spread fast, and by 1885, cocaine's ability to numb meant it was widely used in British medicine as a cure for seasickness, hay fever, even common cold. You could take it any number of ways. You could take it as a powder dissolved in drink. You could smoke cocaine cigarettes. You could even inject yourself with a DIY kit complete with a hypodermic syringe.
It would be decades before cocaine's harmful and addictive effects were discovered. But how to stop pain remained one of the great medical quests of the Victorian age. And pain-free surgery would remain tantalizingly out of reach until one man's fantastic invention rocked the medical world. The Victorians had built hospitals that were the envy of the world, and broken new ground in surgical practice.
But for all their medical advances, there was one thing that had so far eluded the Victorians, and now they set their sights on this holy grail, to make surgery pain-free.
We've been using anesthetics for so long, it's hard to imagine an operation without them. But when Victoria came to the throne, surgeons were experimenting with almost anything they could lay their hands on. Laughing gas, ether, and the latest drug chloroform were all being used with very little means of controlling the dose.
It all sounds terribly hit and miss. Were there fatalities?
15-year-old Hannah Greener, she was suffering from an infected toe. The physician who she was being attended by thought this was a good opportunity to test the effectiveness of chloroform. But unfortunately, when they were administering the drug before the procedure, just on a handkerchief over her face, she actually died from an overdose of chloroform.
The press had a field day. Newspapers were filled with shocking stories of death by anaesthetic. Physicians despaired, doubting whether the drug could ever be safe. The solution came from a forward-thinking doctor called John Snow. Although Snow would go on to make his name tackling the cholera epidemic, in 1853 he made a breakthrough that would alter the course of medical history.
And what John Snow does is he invents a device which can give a measured, consistent dosage of anaesthetic throughout a surgical procedure.
One of these early chloroform masks survives to this day.
So this is the anaesthetic mask which he developed. This would be attached to a tube, which would then connect to a bottle filled with a small rag soaked in chloroform. As you can see on the inside that there are various different valves in there, which when you put this on, much the same way as a modern surgical mask, just like this, it would regulate the dosage consistently throughout the surgical procedure. And this became known as the Snow mask.
And what difference did that make?
It meant that you could standardise dosages across a lot of different surgical procedures. You could get yourself a Snow mask, make sure that you put a little bit of chloroform in the bottle, and be more confident that your patients wouldn't suffer fatal consequences during an operation.
Not surprisingly, the public was still cautious about chloroform. But all that changed when Snow got an invitation from a very special patient.
The key contribution was when Snow was invited to administer chloroform to Queen Victoria for the birth of her last two children. She'd been actually keen to try it earlier, but some of her personal physicians had warded her off the idea.
It must have been a nerve-wracking few hours for Dr. Snow. But his pioneering mask worked. The Queen delivered her baby safely, and by all accounts, she was delighted.
Later, she referred to chloroform as that blessed chloroform. So clearly, her influence in the public domain, praising its effects and crediting it with a less painful childbirth, that had a major impact on convincing sceptical publics that chloroform was safe and, well, if it was good enough for a queen...
Soon to be an empress, yeah.
It was probably good enough for them as well.
With the Queen's blessing, anaesthetics had arrived, one of the greatest surgical advancements of the Victorian age. However, cutting a body open was still a risky business. What was needed was to be able to look inside without going inside. But how could that be possible? The idea was pure science fiction. While Victorian writers like H.G. Wells were thrilling their readers with tales of machines that could travel through time, a dazzling discovery by a German scientist gave Victorians a machine that could see through skin, right inside the human body. These are some of the first films of X-rays, shown in 1897. A flexing frog's leg, a beating human heart, and even a stomach in action.
The Victorians revolutionised surgery from being the last resort for the truly desperate to being literally the cutting edge of healthcare in Britain.
6 months after their discovery, X-rays were being used by battlefield surgeons to locate bullets in wounded soldiers. With technology as advanced as this, medicine was entering a futuristic age.
Britain's medical outlook was transformed under the Victorians. Hospitals became sanitised palaces of healing and treatment. Surgical pioneers pushed the boundaries of anatomy, devising the life-saving procedures we depend on today. And Britain's mentally ill were finally treated with humanity and care. The innovation and fearless campaigning of Victorian medical reformers laid the foundations for the National Health Service. We owe them a great deal.
Next time, I explore the harshness of the Victorian prison regime.
They would quite literally put salt into the prisoners' wounds.
Learn how the police bagged the age's most notorious criminals.
We do have some of the real-life Peaky Blinders. Their photographs were taken right here.
And I discover how the era witnessed a law and order revolution.
If you came up in these courts, it must have been a mighty frightening experience.